How old is the Earth? Is it 6,000 years old, or is it 4.5 billion years old? Or is the answer somewhere in between? Let's have a look at it. Let's start with the Genesis creation story. There are different views on this story. Some take it literal, and some take it figurative. Some are somewhere in between. Some think it happened in 6 24-hour days, others think this is a figurative framework, or that the 6 days were really some longer expanse of time than 24 hours. Another theory is the gap theory. It is also known as the chaos restitution theory, and it came about in the 18th century and was popular with some prominent theologians of the time like John Wesley, and remained popular into recent times. What it suggests is there is an unknown gap of time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, and other things may have occurred during this gap of time. It may not be a coincidence that this theory came about in a century when scientists started presenting evidence of an old Earth. But nothing in the text suggests this was the intended reading, so it is entirely speculative. Not only should it probably not be read as a gap of time between the verses, but the two verses should actually be read together with verse 3 as one complete thought. There may also be a misunderstanding of what the word create means in the ancient context. Although it's been long thought by many that God is creating from nothing, that might not have been how the original writer intended the story to be understood. In the ancient world, things were often described not by the material properties, but by its function in an ordered system. An example would be the sun doesn't exist by virtue of its gaseous material properties, but by the role it plays for humankind and society. Consequently, something could be manufactured physically, but does not exist until it has become functional. The opening line of Genesis should be translated as when God began to create, instead of in the beginning, according to Michael Heiser, a scholar of ancient Hebrew. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through 2 should be read as one complete thought, not two different sentences. It's important to remember the Bible wasn't originally broken up into verses. The verse numbers were added much later in history to make it easier to find certain passages. In other words, what Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through 2 is saying when God created the heavens and the earth, it was formless and void. So an absolute beginning cannot be derived from the grammar of the verse. Instead, the syntax of the verse, based on well-attested features within biblical Hebrew grammar, suggests the possibility that there were potentially multiple periods or stages to God's creative work. John Walton says the Hebrew word bara doesn't necessarily refer to creation as in material manufacturing, but is better understood as assigning functions or giving a purpose to something. Assigning a function to something is what describes its existence. Bara is used other places like this, such as Psalm 51:10. The writer is asking God to create a clean heart for him, but what he is really asking is not a new physical heart, but assigning a new function. There are places where bara could mean material manufacturing, but it's never a necessary reading. For example, in Genesis 5:2, when it says male and female were created, it could be read like a material creation, but it could also be read like the roles of male and female were assigned to them. Sometimes it could be read either way, but there are other places where it has to mean assigning functions, like Psalm 51:10. Genesis 1:5 is an example of God assigning a function. He called the light day and the darkness night. In Genesis 1:11, God says to let the land produce vegetation. In Genesis 1:14, God sets the lights in heavens to be signs for seasons, days, and years. These are examples of God assigning a function to something, giving it its purpose. Think of creation as building something out of various materials, like a house. The materials already existed, but they had to be assigned purposes and put together a certain way. Jeremiah 4, verses 23 through 26, describes what seems like a decreation. However, it could be recreated by using what is left and assigning new purpose. We might not have an agreement on how long ago creation started, and we might not all be in agreement with what happened before creation. There are those that say there was nothing before creation, but there are also those who say it is obvious there was something before creation. The Genesis story seems to start creation from nothing, but there are those who see it as more of just a starting point for the story of the Hebrew people. The Old Testament is a history of the Hebrew people, and Adam is the common ancestor they all came from. Adam led to Noah, and Noah led to the patriarch Abraham, who led to Isaac and then to Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Speaking of Noah, though, there are a lot of similarities in Noah's story to the creation story if you start the story from Noah's flood. Genesis 1 verse 2 and Genesis 7 verse 24 start with a watery chaos. In Genesis 8 verse 1, God sends a wind over the earth and the water recedes, similar to how the Spirit of God moves over the surface of the waters in Genesis 1 verse 2. In both stories, dry land appears after this point. Soon after that, in Genesis 1, animals are created, and in Genesis 8, the ark is opened and animals leave the ark to go back into the world. Then, in both stories, God tells both Adam and Noah to go forth to be fruitful and multiply. In both stories, God gives Adam and Noah dominion over the earth and its plants and animals. In Genesis 2, verse 7, it says God created man from the soil, and in Genesis 9, verse 20, Noah is described as being a man of the soil. Granted, in Noah's context, this was probably a way of saying he was a farmer, but that is essentially what Adam was supposed to do too. Adam was corrupted by a fruit, and Noah got drunk on wine, which is made from fruit. Adam realized he was naked and covered himself up, and Noah got naked and was covered up by his sons. While the two stories aren't identical and may not even seem similar at first glance, when you really stop to compare them, they actually are pretty similar. In Noah's story, God says the world won't be destroyed by flood anymore. But is it possible it could have already been destroyed by a flood prior to Adam? And the creation story of Genesis 1 wasn't just a creation out of nothing story, but a story of God cleaning up and assigning new purposes and functions to already existing material? There's nothing written there to really say what happened before the creation of the earth, so it's hard to say for sure if we should read it as the beginning of everything, or just where the Hebrew people begun their story at. So what have others throughout history thought about how old the earth was? Now, you might think the young Earth creationists are just clinging to an ancient worldview that contradicts what modern scientists say. But it's not true that all ancient Christians believed the Earth was only created a few thousand years or so before their time. Sure, there were probably many who thought that way in ancient times, but they probably had never had heard of any other viewpoint on the subject, so they didn't have much reason to question it. But most of your average Christian people, just going about their days, probably didn't spend much time thinking about the age of the earth either. But there were some Christian theologians who did think about that kind of thing. Saint Irenaeus, who famously wrote against Gnostic beliefs in the 2nd century AD, wrote that the days of Genesis may have been thousand-year periods, citing 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, where he says a day of the Lord is like 1,000 years. Justin Martyr made a similar reference to the Genesis days being 1,000 years in his dialogue with Trypho. Philo, a contemporary of Christ, thought that creation was instantaneous, and the days of the creation were just a narrative arrangement. Clement of Alexandria held a similar view later in the 2nd century. And although his views changed over time, St. Augustine also held a similar view in the 4th century at one point. Origen and Augustine also noted that the sun was created on the 4th day, which is odd when you consider this is where the light for days comes from, which further indicated to them this may have been symbolic. Even ancient people understood that light for the day came from the sun. St. Basil the Great thought if the sun was created on the 4th day, the first 3 days could not have been 24-hour periods. The 12th century philosopher William of Conches thought humans may have developed via natural processes working together. It's not quite Darwinism, but I think you can see some proto-evolutionary thinking there. Robert Grosseteste thought light and matter was created and then the universe expanded from there. This is a view that sounds a bit like the Big Bang Theory, but hundreds of years before the Big Bang Theory was developed. It might be interesting to note here that the Big Bang Theory itself was developed by a Catholic priest named Georges Lemaitre in the 1920s. Granted, he was also trained as a physicist and was a professor at the Catholic University of Louvain. But it's interesting that the theory was developed by someone who many would probably associate with not having a scientific view of creation. Lemaitre did not think his view on the Big Bang was in conflict with his religious beliefs.
St. Thomas Aquinas recognized a variety of interpretations. He considered the views of earlier church fathers on the subject, but focused more on the act of creation itself in his work. He thought it was an important distinction that only God could create from nothing, but could also form things out of existing materials, such as how he did when creating Adam from dust and Eve from Adam's rib. But Aquinas also noted that the Genesis story was like a framework. The first 3 days were works of distinction, creating from nothing. The next 3 days were adornment, or in other words, making something out of now existing material. Aquinas thought certain matters of faith were necessary, like believing in the Holy Trinity, but in considering the views of the days of creation of earlier church theologians, he did not think it was an important matter of faith to adhere to one specific view on the length of time of creation, since earlier church fathers did not have the same view on the matter. In more recent times, in 1785, Rev James Douglas promoted that the earth was created in 6 expanses of time instead of 6 days. And in 1865, Reverend Richard Maine wrote, "Some school books still teach to the ignorant that the earth is 6,000 years old. No well-educated person of the present day shares that delusion." The view on creationism is similar in Judaism. Some ultra-Orthodox Jews believe in a literal 6 days, but many other Jews view it in a figurative way. In Islam, like Judaism and Christianity, creation is broken down into 6 days, but the word used for days has also been interpreted by some to refer to an age or an eon. Aristotle and some other ancient Neoplatonic philosophers espoused a view called Eternalism. They thought time had no beginning or end, and thought the earth was infinitely old. Even though Christian theologians didn't all agree on how old the earth was, they disliked this view because it appeared to deny the existence of a creator at all. Ancient Indian Hindu religious scholars thought the universe perpetually renewed itself by exploding, expanding, collapsing, and then beginning again anew, and could be measured in billions of years. This is a cyclical view of time. You can also find beliefs in cyclical time in ancient China and around the world with other cultures like the Maya and the Aztecs. The Catholic view is open to interpretation. In 1909, the Pontifical Biblical Commission, or PBC, issued a series of responses to questions on Genesis 1 through 3. Among these, the PBC answered the following questions. In the interpretation of those passages in the chapters, which the fathers and doctors understood in different manners without proposing anything certain and definite, it is lawful to follow and defend the opinion that commends itself to one. In the designation and distinction of the 6 days mentioned in the first chapter of Genesis, and may the word yom, or day, be taken either in the literal sense for the natural day or in the applied sense for a certain space of time, and may this question be the subject of free discussion among exegetes. Further liberty on the question was granted when Pope Pius XII approved a reply from the PBC that effectively nullified the restrictive aspects of the PBC's 1909 replies, stating, "These replies are in no way a hindrance to further truly scientific examination of these problems in accordance with the results acquired in the last 40 years. In recent years, the Church has adopted at least the outlines of an official position in the interpretation of the 6 days. This happened in 1992 with the release of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which states, God himself created the visible world in all its richness, diversity, and order. Scripture presents the work of the Creator symbolically as a succession of 6 days of divine work, concluded by the rest on the 7th day. There isn't really an official canon statement regarding the 6 days of creation the Church expects its members to adhere to, but the Church leadership seems to favor a figurative view. Similarly, the Orthodox Church view seems to favor a figurative interpretation as well. In 2008, the United Methodist Church's highest legislative body passed a resolution saying the science descriptions of Cosmological, geological, and biological evolution are not in conflict with the Church's theology. Moreover, the Church states that many apparent scientific references in the Bible are intended to be metaphorical and were included to help understand the religious principles, but not to teach science. In 1982, the Episcopal Church passed a resolution to affirm its belief in the glorious ability of God to create in any manner, and in this affirmation reject the rigid dogmatism of the creationist movement. The Church has also expressed skepticism towards the intelligent design movement. Young Earth creationism was popularized in the early 20th century by Seventh-day Adventists, a church whose co-founder, Ellen White, had a vision of Creation Week that was 7 24-hour days. Later, another Seventh-day Adventist named George McReady Price expanded on this by reinterpreting paleontological finds as flood geology. Later, in 1961, theologian John Whitcomb Jr. published a book with engineer Henry Morris named The Genesis Flood that rehashed Price's earlier ideas of the flood causing the paleontological layers. Modern scientists date the age of the Earth to be 4.5 billion years old. This view is primarily concluded upon by using radiometric dating methods. I'm not an expert on the topic of radiometric dating, but basically it's based upon measuring the rate of decay of isotopes of radioactive elements into more stable daughter isotopes in a predictable amount of time known as half-life. The date of a sample is based on the ratio of parent-to-daughter isotopes in a sample. Using carbon-14 method as an example, when something dies, the carbon-14 in its body begins to decay, becoming nitrogen. Because the rate of decay of carbon-14 is known, it can be compared to the carbon-12 in a specimen because carbon-12 does not decay, so they can measure the age by making that comparison. Claire C. Patterson first used a meteorite from Canyon Diablo and other space rocks to get the date of 4.5 billion years in 1953. It wasn't considered a major revelation at the time, and later in life Patterson said, "No one even cared about it. Even today, people don't care how old the Earth is. In fact, less today than 40 years ago when I measured it." It's difficult to come up with an exact age with Earth rocks due to the rock cycle. Rocks can change form over time, going back and forth from igneous to metamorphic to sedimentary. Because of this, rocks from meteorites that have not been altered by the rock cycle are dated instead. But I have another problem with radiometric dating methods in general. I'm not convinced that knowing the rate of decay of certain elements is good enough to reliably date an object. In 2008, physicists Jared Jenkins and Ephraim Fishback published a study that showed decay rates are not actually constant. They were studying the decay rates of silicon-32 and radium-226 specifically, and found that the decay rates over time vary and correlate with variations in the distance between the Earth and Sun. Now you might think, well, if they can tell it correlates with variations in the distance of the Sun, then they can add that into the calculations. But that isn't the point. The point is the rate of decay actually isn't constant and can be affected by other factors. You might be able to track the distance of the Sun at one point in time or another, but how do you account for other things that could affect the rate of decay, like solar flares? They say the amount of carbon-14 is constant because when something dies, it turns to nitrogen, but up in the sky, nitrogen gets turned into carbon-14. So basically, it seems there is always the same amount of carbon-14 on or around the Earth. But how can you really know that for sure? How can you be sure some more didn't get added at some point in time? Or maybe even some of it somehow escaped the atmosphere and went into space? I don't know how either of those scenarios might have occurred, but I'm not convinced that scientists can be absolutely sure that it never occurred. I've seen stories of material from recent volcanic eruptions dated to millions of years old, such as Mount Ngauruhoe, not sure if I pronounced that right, and Mount St. Helens using the potassium-argon method. I've also seen this refuted as not being a good method to date anything recent because of the long half-life rate of decay of potassium-40. But I think in refuting it, for me at least, you're kind of pointing out why it isn't reliable at all. If it can't be reliable for something you already know for sure how old it is, how can it be reliable for dating anything in any time period, especially if you don't have a way of knowing all of the environmental conditions of the area for the entire history of the world, however long that is. How can you know that the sample hasn't been polluted by something from a later point in time? And if decay rates aren't actually a constant like Jenkins and Ephraim illustrated in their study, then how can you be sure how the decay rates have been affected by environmental conditions that you might not know occurred at any given point in history? I guess the mainstream scientists are still convinced they can know this and account for all of that, but I guess I'm not as confident in their methods as they are. I'm not necessarily saying I think there is no value in radiometric dating at all, just that I'm not convinced it is always accurate, especially for dating very ancient things. In my view, methods like carbon-14 dating can be fairly accurate for dating objects in recent history, and is probably fairly accurate in dating objects anytime in recorded history, and maybe a little beyond that simply because we have a pretty good idea of what happened in recorded history. So, possible intrusions by later objects or changes in environmental conditions can more easily be accounted for. So carbon-14 dating during the last 5,000 years or so I think is fairly accurate, and maybe even back a little longer in some regions. I kind of view the accuracy like a shotgun blast. The pellet spread starts out tight, but spreads out further as it flies through the air. For me, radiometric dating is similar in that it starts out accurate for recent times, but the further back you go, the accuracy begins to spread out, so to speak, or in other words, become less accurate. Somewhere around 10 to 12,000 years ago, the accuracy just begins to fall off, I think. I'm not saying I think the scientists always get it wrong when they are dating something more than 12,000 years ago. I'm just saying I'm not as confident in the precise dating of an object as they are. I tend to place more value in using it as a secondary method of dating objects thought to be from a certain time period. Like when dating an archaeological site, when the archaeologists come up with a date based on either the style of the architecture or the style of the pottery, and they can also confirm their hypothesis using a radiometric dating method of something at the site as well. So I don't consider radiometric dating good as a primary source for dating something. It's more of a footnote for me. I put more value in what the ancient writers wrote and an archaeologist making comparison using building styles, art styles, or pottery styles. So anyway, I basically said all of this just to say that I don't think the age of the Earth established by modern scientists is necessarily accurate, but I'm also not sure how far off they might be in their assessment. So what are we to conclude from all of this? What sticks out to me the most is that throughout history, there hasn't been a uniform agreement as to how old the Earth actually is. Even now, with scientific dating methods, I'm skeptical of the date that scientists have established for how old the Earth is. I think I find Thomas Aquinas' view on the matter to be the best one. He didn't think any one view of the age of the Earth was an important matter of faith. I think that holds true today as well. Basically, it doesn't matter how old the Earth is. We are here now, and that's what really matters now. Those are my thoughts on that. Thanks for listening.